Hello, and welcome to Out West, the official podcast of the Western Governors Association. I'm Jack Waldorf, the Executive Director of WGA. Last year, as chair of WGA, Wyoming Governor Mark Gordon launched the Decarbonizing the West initiative to examine how methods of decarbonization can position Western states at the forefront of innovation and reduce the effects of carbon emissions on the environment. The initiative explored a wide range of engineered decarbonization and natural sequestration strategies, everything from direct air capture and carbon credit markets to climate-smart agriculture and biofuel, all of which present enormous opportunities for Western states. In this episode of Out West, WGA Policy Advisor Abby Pelsmacher speaks with some of the country's leading decarbonization experts about how these methods have evolved in recent years and their prospects for the future. To learn more about these decarbonization strategies, including federal policy recommendations for advancing the industry, check out the Decarbonizing the West initiative report on WGA's website.
All right, well, thank you. Our first guest today is Assistant Secretary Brad Crabtree. He oversees the U.S. Department of Energy's Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management and has been a leader in carbon removal for over 20 years now. Mr. Crabtree, what first inspired you to get involved in carbon management?
Well, thank you for that question because I'm actually in my 22nd year of working on carbon management. I started in North Dakota in 2002, and my inspiration was a project called Dakota Gasification, which is a major industrial facility in western North Dakota that has hundreds of very high-wage jobs at that plant. And in the year 2000, they started capturing CO2 from the gasification of lignite coal, transporting that CO2 200 miles by pipeline to southern Canada, where it's being permanently geologically stored ever since. Tens of millions of tons of CO2 have been stored in southern Saskatchewan that came from this plant. And what was so inspiring to me as someone who grew up in a part of the world that's dependent on energy production and agriculture in these industries, here's a technology pathway that allows industries, rather than to basically go away, to transform themselves with new technology to reduce or eliminate CO2 emissions while sustaining all these high-wage jobs. And in parts of the world like where I come from, in the northern plains of the United States, that is where all the key jobs are, and all these communities depend on these industries. So I got very excited as a young professional because I saw a way for us to address the climate challenge in a way that would gain support from all the industries, heavy industry, energy production, manufacturing. This provides them with a path forward for solving the problem and keeping all these jobs and supporting all these communities. So I just think it's such an essential part of what we need to do to solve the climate problem.
There's been a lot of news about carbon removal lately, and I think a lot of people consider it a futuristic pipe dream. Can you briefly describe the current state of the industry and talk about some of the recent developments that are pushing the industry forward?
Absolutely. So in the context of carbon capture, thanks to the research and development funding coming from the Department of Energy and Industry, the first generation of carbon capture technologies, they're already out in the marketplace, if you will. And that involves using solvents to capture CO2 from combustion streams from power plants and industrial facilities when fossil fuels are burned, or when industrial processes emit CO2, we can use those technologies. But then there's a whole second generation of carbon capture technologies that aren't yet commercialized, that use different ways to capture the CO2, that will be able to hopefully improve the performance and reduce the cost of carbon capture. So we're in the process of deploying carbon capture very broadly, but then working on the next generation of technologies. When you get to direct air capture, where we're getting that CO2 from the atmosphere, then those technologies are much less mature. We're funding some technologies where they're only capturing, 1,000 tons of CO2 a year from ambient air, all the way up to what we call our regional direct air capture hubs. One of those hubs is in Texas on the King Ranch. And Occidental Petroleum will be capturing 500,000 tons of CO2 from the atmosphere and storing it geologically underground in Texas. But that's pretty extraordinary. That would be the largest carbon dioxide removal or direct air capture project in the world, and the first time it becomes truly commercially large scale. When it comes to actually transporting and storing the CO2 geologically, we actually know how to do that. It may surprise your listeners, but we have actually around the world in the United States and different countries injected and stored over 250 million tons of CO2 deep below ground permanently and safely. Most people have no idea that we have that much experience doing that. And as far as transporting the CO2, we have over 5,000 miles of CO2 pipelines in the United States, and we've been transporting CO2 millions of tons a year since the 1970s. And one of the pipelines transports tens of millions of tons of CO2 a year for a distance of 500 miles across several states. So this is a technology that's actually very well known. Part of the challenge in a lot of these things isn't the technology per se, it's the cost in building a business around the technology. So part of what we're trying to do is to bring the costs down, but also to create business models where capturing and managing CO2 can become commercially viable. We're relying on the funding in the bipartisan infrastructure law, as well as the tax credits that were enacted in the Inflation Reduction Act. The combination of that funding from the Department of Energy and the tax credits are providing the incentives that companies need to start putting these technologies into practice in the real world.
Throughout Governor Gordon's Decarbonizing the West initiative, we heard a lot about the 45Q tax credit. Can you provide some context about just how important this is for the industry's development?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Before I joined the Department of Energy, I spent about a decade of my life working on the 45Q tax credit. So the 45Q tax credit has been around for many years, but initially it did not have enough value. And it wasn't guaranteed and in place long enough for it to actually result in investments in projects. Back in 2018, Congress reformed and expanded the 45Q tax credit, increased the dollar value of the credit, and made it available for a specified time period. It was guaranteed in law. And so that started to really cause interest in the industry to pick up in developing and deploying carbon capture projects. Then, just 2 years ago, with the Inflation Reduction Act, we got the next round of improvements or enhancements to the 45Q tax credit. And what it did is it increased the value to $85 per metric ton of CO2 that's captured and stored, whether from an industrial facility or a power plant. And that was a substantial increase in the amount of funding. And availability of the tax credit was expanded for a whole decade. And so now any project that begins construction by the end of 2032 will be available for the tax credit. So from when the legislation was passed until the end of 2032, for the first time, industry has a full 10 years to plan and invest in projects. And we've never had that before. One of the things that I would note also, and this is often a misunderstanding, it's a performance-based tax credit. And what that means is a company cannot get this federal support, this federal incentive, until they've actually captured and stored the CO2 and demonstrated that they've stored the CO2. So this is a really great tax credit in that not only is it driving all this investment, but as U.S. taxpayers, we're not supporting these projects unless they are actually successful. The final point I'd make about 45Q is the response in the marketplace. So right now, we have 18 commercial scale operating carbon capture and storage projects in the United States, and they're capturing and storing about 20 to 25 million tons of CO2 a year. Now, that's very significant in terms of showing that the technology works, but it's not significant in terms of actually having a big impact on reducing our emissions and addressing climate change. That's clear. What's exciting is that since the Inflation Reduction Act was passed, we now have about 220 carbon management projects under development in the United States today. So 18 operating all the way to 220 under development. And it's across the whole range of industries where carbon capture is an important future technology. So this is really exciting. We know that not all of these projects will ultimately be successful. That's true of renewables. It's true of other energy projects. Some move forward, some don't. But it's an enormous transformation in the level of projects and activity on the ground to address this challenge.
To learn more about some of the projects that are being developed as a result of additional federal support, we spoke with Holly Kretka, the Executive Director of the University of Wyoming School of Energy Resources. Holly, thanks for joining us. We just spoke with Assistant Secretary Brad Crabtree about how federal investments have helped jumpstart the CCUS industry in recent years. Much of the innovative work in the world of CCUS is happening at the Wyoming Integrated Test Center, which you help oversee. Can you tell us about some of the exciting work going on there these days?
So when it comes to new technology innovation, part of that is going to be on the computational side. Some of that is creating better materials in the labs of all the universities around the country, and not just universities, but research-minded companies as well and national labs. And then we also need to just deploy some of these systems so that we can learn what the challenges are, what's working, what's not working, and then fix it. And that's just something that America has really been good at over the years, is driving down costs once you get something deployed. But you have to get those first facilities built. And so that's really what we're trying to get done. The technologies being demonstrated at the Integrated Test Center are carbon capture and use technologies. And I should say that it's really an international technology neutral test site, meaning that any entity that is developing a carbon capture technology can come to the Integrated Test Center, plug in their technology, have access to utilities and real flue gas. And that flue gas is from Basin Electric's Dry Fork Power Station, which is one of the newest coal plants in the country, and really has all the bells and whistles in terms of environmental controls so that they can test new technologies at a larger scale. It's really important that for carbon capture and really any environmental technology that there's a lot of different vendors and a lot of different processes, because what works at one power plant might not work at another. So we have folks from Japan. Kawasaki Heavy Industries is testing a new solid sorbent, and we have a company called TDA from Colorado working on a new technology as well, and then GTI, just all different technology developers. For example, one is NTR, Membrane Technology Research. It's a company based out of California, and they're testing a membrane-based technology, but this is the largest scale it's ever been tested at. So they're working at about a 10 megawatt scale. A power plant might be 400 or 500 megawatts. So they're taking a tiny fraction of the flue gas. But one of the really exciting things about MTR's technology is that it's very modular. So it comes in shipping containers that fit on the back of a typical semi. And this is the last test that they will need before they can offer really a large scale commercial system. So it's been a really exciting project.
We've talked a lot about capturing carbon so far, but that's only half the battle. In order to eliminate its effect on the atmosphere, carbon must either be stored, a topic we'll get into shortly, or put to use in some other way. Throughout the Decarbonizing the West initiative, we heard about all sorts of uses for CO2. By far the largest use in the West is enhanced oil recovery. Can you tell us a little bit more about this process and why it's been such an effective use for captured carbon?
Sure. Enhanced oil recovery has been around for a long time, many decades. Here in Wyoming, we have Exxon's Chute Creek or LaBarge facility, which produces lots of CO2. I think there's about 6 million tons per year being produced and purified, and they're expanding that up to 7 million tons a year. So there's a CO2 pipeline that takes that CO2 to different oil fields around the state. Generally, in Wyoming, we mostly have conventional oil and gas production. So over time, you lose pressure during production, and you can use a water flood. So you're injecting water to increase production again. And then the third step sometimes is injecting CO2. And CO2 has a couple different functions. It can help increase the pressure, but it also can displace essentially oil and gas molecules on rock underground. So the CO2 will stick to the rock and let the oil and gas kind of untether itself. So you can increase production, and it's very effective. And when you do this, the CO2 is permanently stored. Now, some of it will come back up with the oil, but because producers have paid for that CO2, they want to use it more. So they'll separate it from the oil and maybe gas when it comes up, and then they'll re-inject it. And so at the end of a field, if you wanted to store all that CO2, you would close up the field and it would remain underground. That's something that we have a lot of experience with. It's by far the largest potential use for CO2 compared to anything else. And the other thing that I think is really important to realize is we have a very robust oil market. We all have cars, we use different materials. It's in medicines and plastics. Most of what is in our kind of modern life has some sort of oil and gas footprint. And so this is still a very robust market with a lot of demand, and oil produced using enhanced oil recovery has a lower carbon footprint than other types of oil produced, particularly oil produced overseas. So it's an important point because if you restrict it, but you haven't done anything to decrease demand, all you're doing is shifting production to other places that have a higher carbon footprint for their oil. And so really there's no benefit from a greenhouse gas perspective, but you've kind of shifted the revenue away from these energy communities and you've shifted the oil production to somewhere else. So we really feel like enhanced oil recovery is an important part of the nation's oil production and like to see it go up. We actually just need more CO2 here in Wyoming.
Storing carbon deep underground is another way to diminish carbon dioxide's effect on the atmosphere. As executive director of the University of Wyoming School of Energy Resources, you also oversee Wyoming's Carbon Safe program, one of the 13 original carbon capture, utilization, and storage project sites in the U.S. Can you tell us a little bit more about this program and how it will help progress the industry?
Yep. So the Carbon Safe program is a federal Department of Energy program looking at carbon storage hubs. So to qualify for a carbon safe project, you have to be able to identify a location where you can store at least 50 million tons of CO2 over 30 years. And the carbon safe programs, they cover everything. So it's the science and the geology, but also the permitting process, economics, community outreach. It's really everything you would need to develop a commercial scale CO2 storage hub. Of course, best practices is to have good commercial partners, and we have that. So at the School of Energy Resources, we've now been selected for 4 of these. Wyoming Carbon Safe is the most established. It is adjacent to Basin Electric's Dry Fork Power Station. We actually have 2 wells in the ground, steel in the ground with Wyoming Carbon Safe that would be ready to accept CO2 from a technical perspective. You have to get the pure CO2 and then the permits in place, of course, to actually do that injection. We don't have the permits in place for the Wyoming Carbon Safe one in Campbell County because those were actually used initially as test wells. We did some water injection to understand the subsurface. And so we're working through the permitting process now. The Department of Energy will likely release a phase 4 application, and it's really where you build out that commercial scale hub. And if we were to apply and get selected for that, then we would have more wells drilled and completed up in the Campbell County area. In the other part of the state, the southwest quarter of the state, we're working with Frontier Carbon Solutions, Sweetwater Carbon Storage Hub, and then we have 2 others that have great commercial partners as well, Williams at Echo Springs, and then one, the Hero Carbon Safe, with quite a few industry partners, 1.5, Calpine, and several other partners that are looking at basalt storage, which is just a type of rock that mineralizes CO2 more quickly. And that's in Oregon, adjacent to a natural gas power plant that uses Wyoming natural gas. So there's all kinds of collaboration opportunities, and the Carbon Safe program has really been a great way to develop these carbon storage hubs. So there's lots going on.
Currently, only Wyoming, North Dakota, and Louisiana have been granted Class 6 well primacy, an authority granted by the EPA to states to administer carbon injection wells. One of the policy recommendations in the Decarbonizing the West Initiative report was for the EPA to establish clear and consistent guidelines for states seeking primacy and to expedite this permitting process so that more storage sites can be developed. To learn more about the process of applying for this authority, I spoke with Lily Barkow, the Groundwater Section Manager at the Wyoming Department of Environmental Quality. She helped lead the Equality State's bid for primacy. Lily, thanks for joining us. For starters, can you walk us through the process that Wyoming went through to gain Class 6 well primacy?
Well, our primacy process actually started years before I even came into the Water Quality Division, starting around 2008, where there was a work group that was developed that consisted of members from Wyoming DEQ, the Oil and Gas Commission, and Wyoming Geological Survey. And they evaluated the risks when it comes to carbon storage and what that would look like financially and protection of human health and the environment at that time. So, legislation was designed pretty early on for this particular activity and then carried on with some improvements. We had rules in place even before the federal government had rules. And then we had to modify those rules once we were beginning to seek primacy to make sure that they were as stringent as federal government. So taking all of that had already been in place years before, and then, Wyoming's had primacy of other underground injection control wells since 1983. So this was just a program revision to add Class 6. It fit very well into the portfolio for our underground injection control program. And a lot of the things that we already do for our Class 1 deep disposal wells carries over quite well for the Class 6 program. And even the enhanced oil recovery wells do also. It's really important that states get primacy and work on these, mainly because we have a dedicated team consisting of geologists and engineers that works in the program that are familiar with the environment, the geology, and the communities. We often say Wyoming knows Wyoming. We're part of the communities. We know the people. We know the industries. And above all else, we know the geology. So we're not going to put a storage unit in an area that's not the right conditions compared to others.
Are there grant programs or opportunities that have been helpful in driving forward some of the geology research that's necessary here?
Any of these projects, as they're starting to drill the wells, they'll have to collect a lot of the rock or core sample. And Wyoming, we received a grant last year from DOE to put together a database of all of the different information that one would use for reviewing a permit application for a regulator, for us to ground truth information that's provided to us. So, there's a lot of different sources out there, but when they're actually in the field and collecting that data, that will be really valuable information. So taking whatever has been collected at other drill sites and then the current Carbon Safe projects where they're doing drilling as well, and analyzing all of those cores will just help regulators in the long run. So it's really important to get these kind of test projects out there because we are drilling into areas that may not have information.
Yeah.
So, we're seeing some of these rock and cores, for the first time. So it's that opportunity to completely geek out. It's really a once in a lifetime opportunity for a regulator because, we're so focused on the rules and making sure what's provided to us meets the rules. But then we also get to put on a research hat and really get into the science and look at the formations, and for a geologist to be able to really look at the type of rocks, the chemical formulas for those formations, looking for any kind of faults or fractures. It's an incredible opportunity.
Since receiving primacy, how has the industry responded? Are you seeing significantly more project proposals?
Ever since receiving primacy, we've just been on the go. We received primacy in 2020 and had some rule modifications to do. And then we received our first application in December of 2021. Shortly thereafter, a lot of informational meetings, working with different operators to help them understand the process, which then resulted in, another 3 applications, which then led to those being issued last December of 2023. They're waiting to finalize their funding mechanisms and then get out there and drill. We ended up with 6 additional applications from another operator, and we issued one of their permits as final last week in one of the areas. We're anticipating upwards of 20 applications within the next couple months. So lots of interest, lots of activity going on, and it's just the right environment here, right geology, and us having primacy. It's been great.
People often associate carbon removal with carbon capture technologies, but natural sequestration can also play a huge role in this discussion. Robert Bonney, the Undersecretary for Farm Production and Conservation at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, has been working on this issue for most of his career. He spoke with us about how natural sequestration fits into the larger suite of decarbonization strategies while also enhancing the nation's land management strategy. Mr. Bonney, thank you for joining us today. For the uninitiated, can you describe what natural sequestration entails and provide some perspective on how big of a role it can play in decarbonization?
Yeah, when most people think about climate change, they tend to think of it solely as an energy issue, reducing greenhouse gas emissions associated with fossil fuel production. But the land has an important role to play. If you look globally right now, somewhere in the neighborhood of 20-25% of global greenhouse gas emissions are actually from the land sector. Most of that is deforestation in other countries. But not only can forests and agriculture contribute to the problem, they can be an enormous solution to the problem as well. In the U.S., our forests already sequester somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 12% of the carbon dioxide emissions we emit every year. And forests are growing. They sequester carbon both in trees and soils and wood products. And so if we can enhance that sink, we can reduce climate change and enhance our forests and create jobs in timber and other industries. Likewise, on the agricultural side, agriculture in the U.S. accounts for about 10%, maybe a little bit more of our annual greenhouse gas emissions. But there are enormous opportunities to sequester carbon in soils, in grasslands. We have opportunities to reduce the emissions associated with nitrous oxide from fertilizing crops and grasses. And we also can do things to reduce methane emissions from livestock. And the opportunity here is actually to create markets or incentives that reward farmers, ranchers, and forest owners who undertake these activities. And so there's an opportunity to do well by agriculture and forestry, even as we protect the environment. With so many environmental issues, we're used to fighting. And we assume that there are these huge trade-offs between doing well by an environmental issue and agriculture or forestry. The interesting thing about climate change is there are lots of opportunities to enhance the productivity of our forests and our agricultural lands to make them more productive, even while we reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And so there's a lot of alignment between the kinds of practices that are good for the environment, good for addressing climate change, and can be good for farmers, ranchers, and forest owners. On the forestry side, we know that wood products are a really important way to store carbon. And we know if we can create forests that are more productive, that are healthier, that don't burn as much catastrophically, that can be really good from a climate standpoint, and be good for our forests and for jobs that depend on forests. On the agricultural side, we know that when we improve soil health through the use of things like cover crops or conservation tillage, that can actually enhance the productivity of our soils and agricultural operations. Likewise, when we have grazing lands that have more soil carbon, they can produce more forage for our cattle. And there are ways to reduce both methane and nitrous oxide emissions in ways that benefit agriculture. So one of the most important things about climate and climate policy is figuring out how do we take advantage of that alignment. And if we can create value for farmers and ranchers and forest owners to reward them when they undertake these practices, we can both enhance their operations, enhance their bottom line, even as we address climate change.
You mentioned wood products and their importance to natural carbon sequestration. Can you expand upon that? What kind of projects are we talking about, and what can the government do to support those developments?
Yeah, so the Forest Service is looking for ways to support innovative uses of wood products markets to support these types of activities. Across the Department, Forest Service, Rural Development, and elsewhere, we've been looking for ways to support the engineered wood products like cross-laminated timber, mass timber, those types of products. It can be really, really important in not only supporting markets that can help working lands, private lands, as well as public land management, but also can embed that carbon in long-lasting buildings. And so it's a really interesting climate solution. So yeah, there are programs to support those efforts, but we're also looking at more innovative products, biochar, or uses of wood and energy. And, you know, I was just in the South here last week, and I know there are places where we're seeing mill closures. There's not as much investment in paper mills, for example. So we really need to look to new markets, new innovations where we can create markets that will reward private landowners who undertake these practices, who frankly just keep their forests in forest use. And likewise, these types of markets will also support the type of restoration we need to do in the West to reduce hazardous fuels there, to support jobs in the forest that can allow us to reduce fire hazards. So wood product markets are really, really important. We're looking at ways both to support directly those industries and then do things like partnerships for climate smart commodities where we might find value in the marketplace that will reward the production of climate smart wood.
Are there other emerging markets you're evaluating as a way to offset the costs of these climate-smart land management projects?
Yeah, biomass could serve a really important role as we look at forest markets. And one of our most challenging areas of forests is finding value for low market timber, small diameter trees. We know in places where we've excluded wildfire or we've excluded prescribed fire or more natural fires that have occurred for decades, we know that we get buildup of these smaller diameter trees, and we need markets to be able to reward folks who go in and remove that or to pay for it on our public lands. So markets for biomass, markets for biochar, anything that uses these small diameter timber. And in the case of biomass, a lot of times what we're looking at is if we don't remove that material, the probability that goes up in a wildfire and that we get emissions there are much higher. If we can take those same materials and we can use them for energy and displace other more polluting sources of energy, there's a real benefit to the climate. There's also a lot of interest in things like sustainable aviation fuel. Can we take certain types of biomass, both agricultural crops and biomass and wood and other products, and turn it into a growing market for sustainable aviation fuels? We know we're going to need to use biofuels in the airline industry, and we look to wood as one of the sources of sustainable aviation fuel. So there's lots of opportunity here, but we've got to look for ways that we can share those costs, in some cases lower them in others. Remember, the costs of a catastrophic wildfire are very, very high. When you think about the cost per acre of fighting those fires, when you think about the potential human costs, lost houses and other things, making some investments in removing biomass and looking for markets is small relative to those types of costs.
Everyone we spoke with throughout this initiative really emphasized the need for partnerships in successful carbon management projects. It's pretty obvious that no one actor can accomplish all of this. Holly, from the University of Wyoming School of Energy Resources, spoke about the importance of having good commercial partners when developing new technologies. But how does this play out in the world of natural carbon sequestration?
Partnerships are going to be critical for this. There are things that the government does well that we can be helpful with, but there are things that the private sector does much better. And there are also areas where the state governments and governors and others are going to be better positioned. And I think we need to figure out, how do we work together? How do we build stronger relationships? And how do we leverage our resources in a way that can help us do things that will benefit our forests, will benefit our communities, they'll make them safer, and they'll benefit our forest landowners as well. We've been partnering with farmers and ranchers and forest owners for a long time through our Natural Resources Conservation Service, U.S. Forest Service, and Farm Service Agency incentive programs. We haven't always called it climate smart, but it's been climate smart. And there are all kinds of things that we're used to doing: soil conservation, tree planting, improved grazing land management. Thanks to the Inflation Reduction Act, we have significant amount of new resources to partner with farmers, ranchers, and forest owners to implement climate smart practices. So $19.5 billion, the vast majority of these are incentives that will go directly to farmers, ranchers, and forest owners to help them implement practices on their lands that will benefit the climate and benefit their operations at the same time. It's all voluntary. It's all incentive-based. It's all locally led in the sense that farmers and ranchers and forest owners get to make their own decisions about what practices work best in their operations. So that's one area that we're excited about. Second area is something we call partnerships for climate smart commodities, where we're working not only with agricultural producers and forest landowners, but we're working with companies, commodity groups, farm groups, forestry groups, to not only implement climate smart practices at scale on private working lands and tribal lands, but also to create markets that will reward those folks for undertaking those practices. So we want to not only implement the practices, we want to measure and monitor the outcomes, and we want to look for ways to monetize that in the market, whether it's through, maybe it's a carbon market, maybe it's a climate smart commodity that's sold directly to consumer, or maybe there are consumer-facing companies that want to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions embedded in their supply chain and are willing to pay for that. So lots of opportunities to look for ways to create incentives here. Some will be through government programs like our conservation programs through the Inflation Reduction Act. Others will be directly through the market. And so we're looking for ways to do both.
Voluntary carbon credit markets are another important avenue for offsetting the high costs of carbon management practices. While they are still a relatively nascent idea, they have the potential to bring billions, maybe even trillions of dollars into the carbon capture, utilization, and storage industry. To learn more about how these markets are developing and what must be done to scale them, we spoke with Eli Kane, the Senior Policy Manager of the Carbon Removal Alliance. Having previously worked on carbon dioxide removal funding programs at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, he's worked on carbon markets both on the governmental and private industry side. For starters, can you briefly describe the different kinds of carbon credits?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think when we talk about the voluntary carbon market, the first thing I like to point out is that it's really 2 or 3 distinct markets, right? So you have your traditional avoidance and reductions credits, which represent about 90% of the credits available on the voluntary carbon market. And then you have the 4% that represents carbon removal credits. And those represent both low durability carbon credits and high durability carbon credits. And of that 4%, only 2% are actually high durability carbon removal credits, which we characterize as having a durability of over 1,000 years. And so in my mind, those are really 3 distinct products, even though we lump them under one voluntary carbon markets label, very similar to at the stock market, right? Where you have securities from equity shares to bonds, both in the stock market, even though they're fundamentally different products. And the same is true for the voluntary carbon market.
So how do we determine the value of the different carbon credits?
Yeah, that I think is the trillion-dollar question. So the Carbon Removal Alliance is focused on advancing high durability carbon removal credits. But I think frequently in this field, we have a false equivalency between high durability and high quality. And really, high durability, in my mind, is only one part of what makes a high quality credit. You also have the operational quality of a project, especially when so much of this field is financed to date on pre-purchases, which is I'm going to buy something now for a promise of future delivery. We need to make sure that the operational quality of these companies is high so that those future deliveries actually happen. Then you have like the scientific quality, which includes your durability measurements, but also everything else that goes into a proper measurement, reporting, and verification plan. So those are things like health and safety concerns. And then finally, you have the community side. We really want to make sure that these projects are operating in a way that really benefit the communities where they're operating in. So the picture of a high durability credit is actually quite complex and ranges from the actual science to the operations to how you interact with a community. I will say, though, there is no steadfast definition of what makes a high-quality credit, and that's something that I think will hopefully emerge over time, and is one area where I think the U.S. federal government has a really large role to play in helping define that standard. Secretary Granholm said credibility is the commodity in the voluntary carbon market space, and that is absolutely true. And there's no faster way to ruin your credibility than to ignore the communities you operate in or to sell fraudulent products, right? Those are the things that will destroy our field before it even starts.
And how does one get involved in these markets and actually purchase credits?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one where there's really not a lot of transparency today. So normally the way this will work is buyers will purchase through a registry, which is kind of the marketplace that will facilitate a transaction. And that registry sometimes is the same as the protocol and methodology developer, and sometimes not. And that methodology is the measurement, reporting, and verification methodology. So in other words, the proof that one carbon credit actually equals 1 net ton of CO2 removed. And then you have a verification body come in and check the math and say, okay, supplier, you have met all the requirements that this MMRV methodology outlines. You can therefore list it on the registry, and the buyer comes in and buys off the registry. It's a complicated process to date. There really is very little standardization between registries and between methodologies. And there's no meta standard to say what makes a good methodology versus a bad methodology. We've seen great advancement in the field over the last few years around creating high-quality methodologies. There's still not one consistent standard to say credit registered on this platform with this methodology is the same as a credit registered with a different platform and a different methodology. Even if both are supposedly direct air capture credits, there really is no meta standard.
You mentioned earlier that you think federal government will have a key role to play in scaling up these markets. Do you have any specific recommendations or thoughts on how to get governments involved?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Carbon Removal Alliance put out a report a few weeks ago outlining key interventions that the federal government can take to develop the MMRV side of carbon removal field. I want to highlight 3 of them, but there are many in that report. The first one will be to continue funding our national labs to develop the technical backbone of MRV. We talk about measurement, reporting, and verification a lot, but there are still a lot of open questions in this field. And the national labs are an incredible venue to help answer those. We employ almost 50,000 people through the national labs. They're some of the most brilliant scientists in our field. And to continue pushing money through that system to help us answer these fundamental questions is really important. The next one would be to authorize an interagency governmental body to kind of coordinate and align MRV efforts across agencies. I think that's going to be important as we scale this field and as we need that kind of coordinating body at the federal level. And the next one would be that quantification standard for MRV methodology that we talked about. Some ability to set requirements that says a protocol must meet these requirements to accurately quantify removals for any given pathway. That will help us just compare apples to apples and make sure each methodology is doing something similar. If we want this market to scale as we want it to and be gigatons of removal and a multi-trillion-dollar industry, we need to create the safeguards today to avoid potential pitfalls down the line. I also want to do a quick call out to the CDR Purchase Pilot Prize, which is the Department of Energy's initiative to buy credits directly from the private sector. And that is the first time ever that a government will buy credits from the private sector. That's an incredible step to enter the voluntary carbon market. And we've already seen traction of that bringing in other private sector buyers and increased awareness from other international governments about that program. So I think, it's starting small. It's only $35 million, which is not going to scale the industry by itself, but it is a first step. It's a pilot to learn what we need to do in order to continue scaling that purchasing work. Maybe the only other one that I'd do a quick call out would be a tech neutral 45Q tax credit. So right now we have the 45Q tax credit, which is a tax credit for sequestration on the direct air capture and carbon capture and utilization side. Having a tech agnostic one that incorporates all different CDR pathways, I think would be really catalytic for the industry. And a bill was just introduced recently to do that exact thing.
If you had to forecast, how do you see these markets growing over the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, that's a hard question. And I think humans in general are just terrible prognosticators. So, I can take some guesses, but that's really all they are. I think the U.S. government has an incredible opportunity to create consistent standards that people play by. And that can happen both implicitly and explicitly. So the CDR Purchase Pilot Prize that I mentioned, part of the intent of that program is to create implicit standards. These are not codified regulatory standards, but they are saying this is how the U.S. government views high-quality MRV providers. And so these implicit standards, I think, can help people coalesce and have a common sense of what is good and bad. Explicit standards obviously help as well. I think in general, though, I'm very optimistic about this field, right? I think we have both an environmental and an economic imperative to continue advancing this field. Carbon removal will help us meet our climate goals. We know that. We know that we'll need 7 to 9 gigatons of CDR by 2050. But it will also build our economy, and it will also bring high demand jobs to our communities. And I think that is a thing that I'm really excited about. Is I think we're finally at an inflection point where CDR companies have started to operationalize their projects. They're working in communities. They're actively creating jobs in a way that is really exciting to see. And that growth will only continue. And as that happens, it'll become a no-brainer. Yeah, we have high-quality jobs in my community because of carbon removal. And that's kind of the inflection point I'm really excited to see.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Out West, presented by the Western Governors Association. To learn more about our ongoing work on decarbonization, please visit westgov.org. And be sure to join us next time as we continue to discuss significant issues facing the Western United States. Finally, WGA would like to thank Assistant Secretary Crabtree, Undersecretary Bonney, Holly Kredka, Eli Kane, and Lily Barkow for sharing their expertise with us. We would also like to extend our gratitude for the Decarbonizing the West initiative sponsors, Basin Electric Power Cooperative, Google, the Idaho National Laboratory, JP Morgan Chase, Net Power, Tri-State, and the Walton Family Foundation. Until next time, we'll see you out west.